Sean, can you explain to me why you think Indigenous foods are important to today's world?
Well, that's a really big question, but it's really about, it's the work that we're doing right now. We truly believe in it. We truly believe that there is this global Indigenous knowledge base that is largely untapped, largely because of the history of colonialism and capitalism and globalism. But we really truly believe that we have all of these Indigenous peoples globally with the blueprint to live sustainably, utilizing plants and animals nearby them in their regions organically. And I feel like in today's world where we're way too reliant on overprocessed foods, packaged foods, and we're not paying attention to our local food systems, which is really the most important thing. Like, we should be really focused on supporting local growth and production of our foods, no matter where we are, because that's what sets us apart. That's our food diversity. And that's what Indigenous peoples had, was this immense amount of diversity that was cherished. There was so much amazing differences and commonalities, but these differences really showcase our true identities of who we are and where we are, and the traditions that came out of the regions that we're from, the different plants and animals that we were utilizing, and the different techniques and styles we utilized for, say, agriculture or food preservation. And there's just so much that we should be really focused on. So we really truly believe that there are a lot of lessons to really help us move forward into a better future as a whole human race.
Do you feel that understanding Indigenous history is important?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. We're in America where we have a prime example of revisionist histories. So if you're going through the United States educational system and you're learning about Indigenous histories, they're not going to teach you what really happened. They're not going to talk to you or tell you about a lot of these really difficult histories that happened against Indigenous peoples. I think it's just really important that people understand, why we talk about pre-colonial foods and pre-colonial knowledge and what that even means. So I like to talk to people about, just what does the word colonialism mean, So the definition of colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers and exploiting it economically, which we've seen over and over. So we look at the damage that happened in this very short time period of world history. And for us in America, we're looking at this very short time period of the US. And people forget how young the United States actually is. So if you think about the United States in the year 1800, we're still not much more than the 13 colonies. We're just a few states on the East Coast, and the Northeast, and in reality, what is the rest of North America, especially the US and Canada and Alaska, it's largely completely under Indigenous control, as it always has been. I mean, you have a different colonialist history with Russia coming into Alaska and Spain coming in from the south and moving into parts of California, of what is California, which doesn't even really become California until the mid-1800s. But people forget how much Indigenous control was there just at the year 1800. But I feel the century between 1800 and 1900 was one of the most damaging for Indigenous peoples, and it's really important for people to understand that. For me growing up, it was just the stories of my great-grandfather who grew up during that time period. He was born in the late 1850s. He saw lots of battles between the U.S. and the Oglala, Lakota. And he sees, eventually the formation of a Pine Ridge Reservation. He sees his kids having to go to boarding schools when he's older. He sees the Battle of Little Bighorn and participates in the Battle of Little Bighorn. He just see so much atrocity happen and so much disparity happening against his community. And it's just so much for one person to absorb. And I feel like, that was just my great-grandfather's era. And, why aren't these histories talked about? Why aren't things like Bear Creek Massacre and Wounded Knee and Whitestone Hill are just kind of buried and just not talked about at all. But I think it's really important, especially for Indigenous peoples. We need to address these wrongs that happened against us, because it's going to be an important part of the healing process for us to all, as a community, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to address these issues and these events that happened that were big changes for all of us. And it's just, it's obviously not fair to hide these histories because they're uncomfortable if you're from the non-Indigenous community, just to make you feel better. That's just a matter of privilege, and we need to get over that. So it's really important that we frame our histories differently, and we talk about the truth of things that happen. We talk about the ugliness that happens, the atrocities that happen, the genocide that happens, and that should be something that we have to teach our youth, all of our youth, so these things won't happen again in the future, because you never know which way the world can go, and things can turn ugly really quickly. So it's really important that we have this education of how not to treat other humans.
Can you explain to me the difference between pre-colonial livelihood and postcolonial?
You think about how pre-colonial Indigenous communities were living and surviving. Basically it was a group effort. Like, people were working really hard, and food is at the center of it, because people are harvesting foods, they're growing foods, they're preserving foods, they're building tools for foods, they're hunting, they're fishing for foods. Everything is there because food is the most important thing. It's the one thing that we have in common as humans across the board, and it's the one thing that should be on top of our priority of where our food is coming from. And the best thing about these Indigenous diets is that they were just so immensely healthy, because there was so much plant diversity, there was so much really healthy animals being utilized, and people were utilizing all parts of plants and animals. I mean, we learned that bits and pieces in history books where Indigenous peoples had figured out a use for every part of the bison. But that's just because as Indigenous peoples, we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful, and we had to be resourceful, and we taught ourselves to be resourceful over millennia. So I think that's a really important lesson, because our society is so wasteful. We throw so much away, and we just really need to think about, utilizing our land space better. The Western diet here in America has never really touched this amazing, diverse plant life that we have nearby us, or even the animals. And it's shunned upon sometimes to even think about using some of these pieces when it comes to an animal that doesn't happen to be a cow, a pig, or a chicken. And just ignoring all these plants and calling everything a weed, and not taking the time to learn about the immense, just utilization of plants around us, because all these plants have purposes. They could be food, they could be medicine, they could be, utilized for all sorts of stuff like paints and dyes and clothing and shelter. You never know. But Indigenous peoples, again, had a millennia of knowledge passed down to understand that, and it was wiped out during that time period, during the 1800s and 1900s. So it's going to be really important for us to learn as much as we can from our ancestors in the past to figure out how to apply those really valuable lessons in today's world. And then if you compare it to Indigenous peoples after colonialism happens, after the reservation systems happen, it's going to be a really tough comparison, because we're forcibly removed from our food systems, we're forcibly put into land spaces that are really tough to grow things on, are really stark in comparison to some of the fruitful areas that were taken over by the colonizers. And we look at the over-reliance on the government-issued foods that still is alive today through the commodity food programs. And what has happened to us as Indigenous peoples utilizing this largely Western diet, these over-processed foods with very little nutrition, and there's a lot of struggles out there. There's a lot of health disparity because of this. It's not just because what happens to our indigenous communities nutritionally after colonialism, after reservation systems, you're just going to see so much disparity when it comes to our health. We have awful statistics where there could be upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes right now in some of our communities, and an immense amount of obesity and heart disease and all of this foodborne illness that is coming from this low nutrition base. And I think it speaks for itself why we should move back towards a healthier, more diverse indigenous diet. I mean, I feel like we could be utilizing so much of our area and utilizing a lot of our foods and really being role models for how non-indigenous communities can also understand a better use of the land and the region through history and through education, and how to eat better.
Can you help us understand how we would define indigenous foods today?
I think the first part about understanding what are indigenous foods and defining it in today's world is first just understanding diversity. So first off, you have to just think about, like, when we're looking at North America, for example, how immensely diverse North America is. I mean, we have all of these growing regions and temperature zones and climate regions. We've got, subarctic all the way down to tropical. We've got mountains and deserts and plains, and there's just, coastal regions. There's just so much amazing diversity across this huge continent and landmass. And when you layer that with indigenous peoples, you can see, again, even more diversity, because every few hundred miles across this landmass in any direction, you're going to be finding a different language, a different religion, different plants, different animals, different techniques, and everything there's different, but we're still sharing a lot of these commonalities of how we're treating our food, of how we're treating the land, of how we're growing things. And it's important to look at the history of indigenous agriculture. It's important to think about the immense amount of seed diversity that indigenous peoples held across this continent. And it's disheartening to think about how much was lost during that push in the 1800s to wipe out indigenous communities all across the US and Canada, and especially when it comes to the agricultural pieces, like how much amazing indigenous agricultural seed diversity did we lose during that time period. And I feel that we are lucky to have still quite a few indigenous seed varieties out there, and we truly have to be the stewards of this, and even though indigenous agriculture didn't reach every single region across North America, we're in a different world today where we should really be, as indigenous peoples, the stewards of these seeds no matter where we are, and trying to help grow a lot of more indigenous gardens and help preserve a lot of this indigenous history that has a direct relation to us no matter where we are in indigenous North America. And when it comes to just the understanding of the natural world around us with the plants and the trees and the soil, and there's just so much we need to be utilizing. So we have to take into account and start to really truly understand the wealth of this plant diversity that that sits with us, and make that a part of it. So when we started doing the work that we're doing, setting up indigenous focused restaurants, cutting out colonial foods like removing dairy, wheat flour, cane sugar, it's going to be really, really important for us to really hold on to and to truly define what is indigenous food. It's up to us as indigenous peoples to define indigenous foods. That's what makes us unique. Like, we can grow our indigenous food base into anything we want to. And right now, it's just like truly paying homage and respect to our indigenous ancestors, which includes the plants around us.
Explain some steps on how we could bring indigenous foods back into our modern foodways.
So the methods that we used was just really trying to understand regional indigenous foods first, trying to really understand what makes each region different, and truly understand, what we can be doing with all of these ingredients, and not following Western-based cooking books, because if you, like myself, growing up in restaurants and learning a lot of European-style cooking and reading a lot of books on European-style recipes, understanding the bases of it, And you know, the Western diet really pays homage heavily into French influence of foods, which is not a bad thing. There's a lot of amazing foods that come out of that, but you know, for us, we wanted to really truly define like what were true North American foods, utilizing indigenous knowledge and utilizing indigenous ingredients. And I think it's really important for us that we have this moment in time in history to define it any way we want to. And it's going to be really important for us to take these steps forward. So I think any indigenous community can do it. So if you take the time to define what are indigenous foods today, you have to take into account how indigenous communities were surviving, again, for millennia, utilizing everything around us, you know. So it's a study in wild foods and permaculture, native agriculture, seed saving, seasonal lifestyles, ethno-oceanography, hunting, fishing, butchery, salts, sugars, fats, where people were getting all of those, indigenous crafting techniques, land stewardship in general, cooking techniques, regional histories, traditional medicines, food preservation, fermentation, nutrition, health, spirituality, gender roles, sustainability. Like there's just so much that we need to be understanding right now, but we can map this. You know, like we can take this knowledge, take this education, and define this basically anywhere. You know, pick a land space. We could do Manhattan. Like what are the indigenous foods of Manhattan? We have the knowledge base to understand that, you know, because indigenous peoples were living in every single region across this landmass, and you know, we can take the time to break it down and to define, you know, what are modern indigenous foods of this area, and to showcase like you know, just how much amazing, fun culinary pieces we're going to be able to come up with. The creativity is going to be limitless and endless of what we can do with all of these plant pieces and animals that are extremely underutilized. You know, so we envision a world where we can drive across North America, whether we're coming from the very southern reaches of Mexico or the very northern parts of Alaska, from the east coast to the west coast, in any direction, and stopping at indigenous focused food businesses run by indigenous peoples from those regions, and exploring and experiencing this immense amount of amazing diversity when it comes to foods. Like, we can basically do this everywhere, but we have to take these steps, you know. We have to normalize this. We have to make this a part of everything that we're doing, and that's really what's been driving us to do the work that we're doing today.
That's great. Sean, can you explain the work of the nonprofit?
So we developed our nonprofit called NATIFS, which is an acronym for North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, with the goal of helping to return access to indigenous education, defining indigenous education in a modern world, and also creating access to indigenous foods within indigenous communities everywhere. So our methodology and what we're attempting to do right now is we are just now opening up our first unit here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, called the Indigenous Food Lab. The Indigenous Food Lab is a training kitchen, it's a production kitchen, it's an education kitchen, it's a space where we can create an educational studio. And our goal is to work directly with tribal communities in our vicinity and offer access to indigenous education, especially around foodways, and to help tribal communities develop their own indigenous-focused kitchen for their community, utilizing ourselves as the main training center, development center, and support center when it comes to these pieces. So we can help tribal communities develop something as small as just a catering operation to make sure that there's at least a small group of people devoted and focused on creating healthy indigenous foods that's going to be particular to whatever tribal community they're going to be working from, to be able to serve this really important food base for this generation. We can also help develop tribes to create full-scale restaurants if that's their motivation, and if they have the resources and funds to, which some tribes do, and to help them train their leadership, train their management, give them all the tools that they need to be able to operate these, again, indigenous-focused culinary operations and just being a support center for them, just being a central hub and a central brain and a central training space for their workers and for their management, teaching them not only how to cook these foods, but how to think these recipes through, how to, all of the operational systems that they'll need to be successful, and just being there for them. Our goal is to replicate this whole model, have a training, development, support, research and development center inside an urban area, working with rural tribal communities and doing this everywhere. So we can open up food labs in Seattle, in Denver, in Boston, in Chicago, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Manhattan, San Francisco, Anchorage, you name it. And there's and because we're looking at this from an Indigenous perspective, and we're not seeing the colonial borders of what is Canada and what is Mexico, who's speaking Spanish and who's speaking English, and really being able to do this everywhere. So we can open up food labs across Canada, we can open up food labs down in Mexico, and just really trying to center and become a center for Indigenous access to Indigenous knowledge. And we just really want to help drive this forward, and we see a very clear path of how to do this. So this is what we're moving on, and eventually we can even open up Indigenous food labs on a global scale. We can have an Indigenous food lab in Australia or New Zealand or Hawaii or Southeast Asia and different spaces, parts of India, Africa, South America, of course, and just really driving this out there so we can help preserve this global knowledge base, because as Indigenous peoples, as our generation right now, like, we are the stewards of all Indigenous knowledge that is surviving in the world today. And we have to do whatever we can to help grow that knowledge base, help preserve it, help make it accessible for the next generations. So people are going to be obviously welcome to reach out directly to us if they want to. Come visit us here in Minneapolis, and see what we're doing, and just be a part of it if we can, and we're just doing our part. We want to help tribes that want to work with us. So if people are interested in working directly with us, just give us a message and let's just start a conversation. But we're hoping that we can create a really strong team, and we can create a lot of educational material that we can share, and create a really strong training center where we can help with this development and help with this vision of this future of eventually one day having Indigenous focused food businesses and food producers all across North America again, and really showcasing the strength of diversity and really showcasing the strength of having this diverse identification out there when it comes to Indigenous regions, and really opening up people's minds about these histories and moving us towards a better situation and taking these steps towards healing this trauma that's been dealt to us as Indigenous peoples. So if people want to learn more, feel free to visit our websites at sioux-chef.com, that's SIOUX-chef.com, or visit our nonprofit website at natifs.org, and that's spelled NATIFS.org. And come visit us down at our soon to be open Indigenous Food Lab in Minneapolis, and just come hang out with us.